hopefully everybody can hear me now. The two things, I'm going to talk about how to organize images through metadata, and then ontologies as a way of making metadata interoperable, and then methods for using these ontologies to annotate, query, and distribute images. So I'll talk about first ideas of what metadata are, and then ontologies, and how do we make them accessible, and how do we use them for annotation, management, and integration. So first, I'm pretty sure everybody knows what metadata are, but just to review that, it's not the raw pixels or the voxels in the image itself, it's data about data. So a lot of times in the DICOM images, it's the header information, it's the patient name, the time the exam was taken, a lot of bookkeeping information that you need to know how to retrieve the images. But also you can add tags or so-called annotations to these images, which might help you then retrieve them. And it's these annotations that I think we're primarily talking about here. If you think about the gene sequences, the annotation on a gene will give you its function. You use the gene ontology a lot of times to do that. But we want to have annotations on images that give you the same kind of idea. So if we want to do that, if we want to share them, we have to have ways of standardizing these annotations. Because you can't just let everybody use their own terms, otherwise we won't be able to share them. So that leads to ontologies, and again, I'm sure a lot of you, probably all of you, I'm just not sure how many of you know what these are, and there are a lot of different definitions for ontologies also. So one way to look at them is they basically start from a standardized terminology, very standardized names for things, but not just the names. The names are organized into, with relations. So you might have, sort of anatomy, you might have what are the parts of something, or what's it connected to, what kind of thing is it. So these relations are what gives the real power to ontologies. These are increasingly implemented in semantic web representations. Again, I believe most of you know about that, but just to remind you, the semantic web is basically a layer built on top of the regular web that gives meaning to the links. So if you think of the web as it is, a URL refers to just a page, but there's no, it's just through a connection. There's no, the computer has no idea what that connection means. The semantic web gives meaning to those relationships, the URLs. And there are these fundamental representations for the semantic web, the resource description framework, and a web ontology language, which is how they store ontologies. And that's the kind of thing I think most people are moving towards, is semantic web representations for ontologies. So now I'm going to talk about a specific ontology, which is one we've built called the Foundational Model of Anatomy Ontology, or FMA. And this has been going on for quite about 15 years in our group. It's basically how to represent the structure as opposed to the function of the body, ranging from organs to molecules. We specifically restrict ourselves to structure because we want to be able to be sort of pure and represented in the most cleanest way. And then that means we have to work with others that are representing function and pathology, for example. Why is the FMA, do we think it's foundational? Is because anatomy, or the structure of the body, is a very good organizing framework. Anybody who's been to medical school, one of the first classes you take is anatomy. And that's because not only do you need to understand anatomy to do a physical exam or do any kind of surgery, you also find that anatomy is a good way to organize all the other information you're learning. And that's primarily because most manifestations of health and disease can be seen as properties of anatomical entities. So here's just kind of an idea of what the idea of what the FMA looks like, and almost any other ontology actually, but in this case it's anatomy. So we have an example of, this is kind of in computer science terms just a graph or a semantic network. You have basically entities, like anatomical entities like the right ventricle of the heart, and these are then related to other entities by means of these named links. So we can say that the right ventricle is a cardiac chamber, which is an organ region, which is an organ part, which is an anatomical structure. That's the backbone of this thing, the anatomy taxonomy. That means that if you know something is a something else, then it inherits all the attributes of the other thing. But you can have many other kinds of relationships. The right ventricle is bounded by the sternocostal surface, which is bounded by, which is a 2D surface, and that in turn is bounded by a line. So you can describe how things are bounded. You can describe the relationships, spatial relationships, that the left ventricle is left of the right ventricle. You can talk about the parts of something, like the right ventricle has the inflow part, wall of right ventricle, etc. So you can come up with a lot of very rich relations, and in fact there are about 150 relation types in the FMA and about 2 million relationships and about 80,000 structures in the FMA. So it makes it a very large ontology, and we're actually representing it in the Stanford Protégé system, which is being maintained by the NCBO, another NCB center. And this is just an example of one of those structures, the esophagus. On the left side is the actual is a hierarchy of the esophagus, so it's an organ with organ cavity, a cavitated organ, etc., all the way up to anatomical entity. And on the right side is the so-called frame associated with that, which are all the attributes. So the esophagus is a member of the set of viscera. It has a definition. It's got synonyms. It's got a preferred name. It's got a unique ID. It's got parts, etc. So this is, you give up here. Oh, what's that? I'm just not getting into that. Maybe I should just hold it.
No, because I think when you're facing that way.
Okay. We'll try it again. So just one other thing about just to say how this is actually one kind of representation called prototype frames, but we are converting it to the semantic web. But just to show how that relates to the semantic web, here these things would all be stored in memory, but in the semantic web, this would be like a URL, a web page, and then this would be going to another web page and another web page. Essentially, each entity is a URL or a URI, they call it, and so this is basically it's global. It's throughout the world using internet addressing. That's kind of what distinguishes the semantic web. So it gives you the chance of making this global knowledge base. And then we've been doing a lot of things lately with the FMA. We're continually adding content, and I just saw Daniel Rubin walking here somewhere. There he is. Yeah, we're working with Daniel to actually, a lot of people are using the FMA now to reorganize their own, for other ontologies, their own anatomy axis. In particular, we're working with Daniel to reorganize the neuroanatomy axis of RADLEX. And one of the specific things that we're doing is using it to reconcile alternate parcellations of the brain. A lot of people, it's not always clear what the neuroanatomy of the brain or the cortex should be. There's lots of different ways of doing it. One of them is the so-called Talairac atlas, which is basically the standardized atlas in which all the voxels are essentially labeled with these kind of names here. And so what you can do if you have your say functional imaging data labeled with XYZ coordinates in a normalized space, so-called MNI space, Montreal Neurological Institute space. You can send those XYZ coordinates down to a so-called Talairac daemon that Peter Fox's group has in Texas, and basically that'll come back for XYZ coordinates. It'll give you this name. So it's sort of automatic annotation approach. But not all there are other atlases that have different kinds of names. So one of the things we would like to do is to be able to reconcile a lot of these names. So what we've done with an FMA is to create the most detailed granularity of parts that we need to. So here is the name, the FMA name for that same thing in the Talairac coordinate. So that means we now can associate, if we have this name, we can find out what the Talairac system, and then by going up and down the part of hierarchy, we can relate it to others. And I'll show you how we use that later on. Another thing we're doing is representing neuroconnectivity, the white matter tracks and what they're connected to. These are all AMIA posters that were presented last AMIA. And another thing, working with lymphatics, getting the detailed synonyms and the description of lymphatics, of course, so we can use it for predicting the spread of cancer. So there's a lot of detail going into the FMA. And there, of course, that's not the only ontology. There are a lot of other ontologies too. RADLEX we already talked about. There's the NCI Thesaurus, which of course is used by the CA Big project. Marianne Martone, I don't know if she's here yet, but is head of the NIF project, Neuroscience Information Framework, which is here, centered here at UCSD. And there's a lot of others, and a lot of these are now being deposited in BioPortal, which is the Stanford, part of the Stanford NCBO, National Center for Biomedical Ontology. So you can go to BioPortal, and you can browse these ontologies, and you can also access them through web services, REST services. So there are a lot of ontologies out there. So the next topic I want to ask is how can you actually make these usable for applications? It's one thing to have them, but how do you actually use them for, say, image annotation or image sharing and integration? Most of these ontologies just go to BioPortal and you download them and you store them in and you use them in your application. But a lot of them, like the FMA, which I said is pretty large, are too big, or they will be too big because they're all growing, and they may be too complex. There's a lot of people. There's ontology purists that want to make the ontologies very perfect, and I guess we are too, and we want to do that. But most application people don't want to see all those detailed classes in between, say, heart and all these other things that it's a subclass of. So our question is, how can we make these ontologies practical for applications without having to require them for download? So through a collaborative grant with the NCBO, we've been building techniques for doing that. And our idea is to allow applications to query ontologies via ontology web services. So instead of downloading the whole thing, you just write a query and ask it questions over the web. And also the idea of using queries to create simplified views of these complex ontologies. If any of you worked with databases, you can make a view over relational tables in a database, and then you can query the view as though it were a table. So that's the idea here. Let's apply that idea to this semantic web idea to the sort of the global database, you might call it. So making views over the global database is what we're trying to do. And then once we have these views, we want to allow querying over these views. And then we have to figure out how to manage all these queries. So we built a web query manager. So like SQL, SQL is the query language for this relational databases. The primary query language for the semantic web is called Sparkle, but that's not quite good enough for making our views. So we've created something called View Sparkle, which has other operations that allow you to more easily extract information from these ontologies. But that itself is very complex, as you'll see in a minute, and so we built another language on top of that makes it easier. And then there's plenty of others, something called module extraction, which we've actually incorporated lately too, and many other kinds of query languages that are available now and are being developed. So this is just a little example. This is a complex, actually simple, really. It's the Sparkle language looks kind of like this, but what we've added to it is the ability to make these subqueries. So this is basically asking for the parts of the liver, just the direct parts of the liver, and all we're doing is just giving me just all those parts, the so-called regional parts. But that's creating any kind of, this is what they call RDF again, Resource Description Framework, Semantic Web. It's creating this idea of a graph, and a graph is just a collection of nodes and relations. So it's creating a graph, a separate graph inside this larger query. And so all you do is you make this little graph inside a subquery, and then you can query that on an outside query, and then that basically gives you the regional parts of the liver, which are the right lobe and the left lobe. And you can continue, you can go beyond that. You can talk about a recursive query, which is again another extension. You start with just basically getting the direct parts of the liver, and then you can get those parts, and those parts, etc. It's called transitive closure. So you're getting basically kind of growing something from a seed and growing it outward, and that's the recursive step. And you can add that here, and then that gives you the parts of the liver, all the way down to the most detailed part. But that's even though that's actually a very simple vSparkle query, but already it's a little bit complex. And so one thing that we've done is to create a thing called the intermediate language, which gives you higher level operations you can use. Given the FMA, extract a whole tree with just one operation. Given another one called the ontology of physics and biology, which we're developing, extract the tree from that, extract edges from both of them, put them together, sort of a data flow kind of idea. And here's that same query for getting the liver parts, now done in IML, and all you do is extract the tree in that one single line. And that also shows the idea that you got input and output, so that naturally lends itself to a graphical interface. And so one of the students built, Nicola Dell in computer science, built a graphical interface for that. So you specify your input, you do these different operations, and you get an output, and you glue them together.